The wind cut through Jamestown, California like a razor blade on that December morning in 1879, and Zelda Stillwater watched through frosted glass as her 7-year-old daughter pressed small hands against the mercantile window, watching fathers lift their children onto wagons outside. Clara had stopped asking why she didn't have a father 3 months ago, and somehow that silence hurt worse than any question ever could. Zelda tightened her shawl around her shoulders and called her daughter away from the window, her voice catching on words she'd spoken 100 times before about needing to get home before the snow came harder. They stepped into the biting cold, Clara's hand small and trusting in hers, and Zelda wondered for the 1,000th time how she was supposed to raise a child alone in a world that measured a woman's worth by the man standing beside her. The storm rolled in faster than anyone predicted. By the time Zelda and Clara reached the small cabin 2 miles outside town, snow was falling in thick curtains that turned the world white and formless. Zelda stoked the fire and rationed the last of their firewood, knowing it wouldn't last through the night if the temperature kept dropping. Clara sat wrapped in every blanket they owned, her lips taking on a faint blue tinge that made Zelda's heart clench with fear. The widow's pension from her late husband barely covered food, and with winter coming early this year, she'd had to choose between firewood and warmer clothes for Clara. She'd chosen the clothes. Now she wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. "Mama, I'm cold," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering. Zelda pulled her daughter close, wrapping herself around the small body and trying to share what little warmth she had. "I know, sweetheart, I know. The storm will pass soon." But the storm didn't pass. It howled through the night like something alive and angry, rattling the cabin's thin walls and finding every crack to send icy fingers through. Zelda stayed awake, holding Clara, feeding the last pieces of furniture into the fire when the wood ran out. A chair first, then the small table she'd brought from her mother's house in Ohio. Each piece burned too quickly, and dawn seemed impossibly far away. When morning finally came, pale and grudging through the still falling snow, Zelda made a decision. She wrapped Clara in every layer they owned, pulled on her own threadbare coat, and stepped out into snow that reached her knees. The town was 2 miles away, but the Ketchum Ranch was only 1 mile east, and she knew Pierce Ketchum sometimes hired hands for winter work. She needed money for firewood, needed it desperately enough to swallow her pride and ask. The snow made every step a battle. Clara stumbled and fell twice before they'd gone a 1/4 mile, and Zelda had to carry her, her arms burning with effort, her lungs aching from the cold air. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark line of fence posts that marked the edge of Ketchum land, counting them like prayer beads, each one bringing them closer to help. She didn't see the rider until he was almost on top of them. The horse appeared out of the white like a ghost, a massive bay gelding with snow crusted on its mane. The man on its back pulled up sharp, and through the swirling snow, Zelda saw a face weathered by sun and wind, dark eyes that took in her and Clara with swift assessment. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with shoulders broad enough to block the wind and hands that held the reins with easy competence. "Madam, you can't be out in this weather," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Where are you trying to get to?" "The Ketchum Ranch," Zelda managed through numb lips. Clara was a dead weight in her arms, too cold even to shiver anymore. "I need to find work. We need firewood." The cowboy's eyes moved to Clara's pale face, and something shifted in his expression. Without a word, he swung down from his horse and reached for the child. Zelda's arms were too weak to resist, and Clara went to him without protest, her small head lolling against his shoulder. "I'm taking you to the ranch," he said, and it wasn't a question. He lifted Zelda onto the horse with his free arm, showing a strength that seemed effortless, then mounted behind her with Clara cradled between them. The horse started forward at his urging, breaking through the deep snow with powerful lunges. Zelda wanted to protest, to maintain some dignity, but the warmth of his body behind her and the solid bulk of the horse beneath her drove all words away. She focused on staying conscious, on keeping her arms around Clara, on not thinking about how close they'd come to freezing to death in the white emptiness. The Ketchum ranch house materialized out of the storm like salvation itself, a sprawling structure of dark wood and stone with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. The cowboy dismounted and handed Clara down to a gray-haired woman who appeared at the door, then reached up for Zelda. She slid from the saddle and nearly collapsed, her legs refusing to hold her weight. He caught her, one arm solid around her waist, and half carried her into blessed warmth. "Mrs. Brennan, get some hot broth," he called to the gray-haired woman, "and blankets. The child's half frozen." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Brennan, who turned out to be the ranch housekeeper, stripped Clara's wet clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets, feeding her small sips of hot broth while Zelda sat in a chair by the kitchen fire, holding a cup of coffee and shaking hands. The cowboy had disappeared to tend his horse, and Zelda found herself watching the doorway, waiting for him to return. When he did, he'd shed his snow-covered coat and hat, and Zelda got her first clear look at him. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in firelight. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, and his hands were scarred too, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. He looked at Clara, now pink-cheeked and drowsing in Mrs. Brennan's arms, and nodded with satisfaction. "She'll be fine," he said. "Another hour in that storm and it would have been a different story." "Thank you," Zelda said, and the words felt desperately inadequate. "I don't know how to repay you. No repayment needed, madam." He poured himself coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, his movements economical and sure. "Pierce Ketchum, owner of this ranch, and you are Zelda Stillwater. This is my daughter Clara. We have a cabin about 2 miles south of town." She met his eyes, forcing herself not to look away. "I came looking for work. We ran out of firewood and I can't pay for more until I earn some money. I can clean, cook, mend clothes, anything you need." Pierce studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The cabin on Willow Creek, the old Henderson place." "Yes." "That cabin's not fit for summer, let alone winter." He said it matter-of-factly without judgment, but Zelda felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. "You have family in town, someone who could take you in." "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "My husband died 2 years ago. It's just Clara and me." Pierce's eyes flicked to Clara again, something complicated crossing his face. "Mrs. Brennan, make up the room in the east wing, the one with the good stove. Mrs. Stillwater and her daughter will be staying here until the storm passes." "Mr. Ketchum, I can't accept charity," Zelda started, but he held up a hand. "It's not charity. I've been needing someone to help Mrs. Brennan with the house. It's too much for one woman, especially in winter when the hands come in for meals 3 times a day. You'll work for your keep, and when the storm clears, we'll talk about wages and getting you set up somewhere warmer than that cabin." Zelda wanted to argue, but Clara made a small, contented sound in her sleep, and the words died in her throat. She looked at this stranger who'd appeared out of the snow like an answer to a prayer. She'd been too proud to speak, and nodded. The room Mrs. Brennan showed them to was larger than the entire cabin they'd been living in. A cast iron stove radiated heat from one corner, and the bed had a real mattress, thick and soft, with quilts piled high enough to drown in. Clara woke enough to eat more broth and some bread with butter, then fell asleep again, Her small body finally relaxed in the warmth. Zelda sat beside her, stroking her daughter's hair, and felt tears slide down her cheeks for the first time in months. She woke to pale sunlight slanting through the window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Clara was still asleep, her breathing deep and even her color healthy. Zelda dressed quickly in her only other dress, wishing desperately that it wasn't so worn and faded, and made her way to the kitchen. Mrs. Brennan stood at the stove, turning strips of bacon with practiced efficiency. She looked up when Zelda entered and smiled, the expression transforming her severe features. "Good morning, dear. Your daughter's still sleeping, I hope?" "Yes, thank you." Zelda reached for an apron hanging by the door. "Please let me help. Mr. Ketchum said I'd work for our keep." "Bless you, child. I won't say no. The hands will be in for breakfast in 20 minutes, and there's 15 of them during winter." Mrs. Brennan pointed to a massive bowl of beaten eggs. "If you could scramble those, I'll finish the bacon and start the biscuits." They worked in companionable silence, falling into an easy rhythm. Zelda found herself relaxing in the warm kitchen, her hands remembering skills her mother had taught her years ago. By the time the ranch hands started filing in, stamping snow from their boots and calling greetings to Mrs. Brennan, breakfast was laid out on a long table. Platters of scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Pierce came in last, and Zelda felt his eyes on her as she poured coffee for the men. He nodded a greeting and took a seat at the head of the table, waiting until everyone was served before he started eating. The hands were a mixed group, young and old, but all of them treated Pierce with respect that didn't seem forced. He spoke to them about the day's work, about checking the cattle in the north pasture and reinforcing the barn roof before the next storm, and the men listened and asked questions without fear. After breakfast, the hands filed out, and Pierce lingered while Zelda and Mrs. Brennan cleared the table. "Mrs. Stillwater, a word when you have a moment," he said. Zelda followed him to a small office off the main room, her heart beating faster. The office was neat and organized, with account books on the desk and a map of the ranch on one wall. Pierce gestured to a chair and sat down behind the desk, leaning back with his fingers steepled. "I sent one of the hands to check on your cabin this morning," he said. "The roof's partially collapsed from the snow weight. Even if you wanted to go back, it's not safe." Zelda felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Everything they owned was in that cabin. Not much, but everything. "Our things," she whispered. "He brought what he could salvage. It's not much, I'm afraid. Most of the furniture was damaged when the roof came down." Pierce's expression was kind but direct. "Mrs. Stillwater, I need to know what your plans are. I meant what I said about work, but I also need to be honest with you. This is a working ranch and winters are hard. If you're going to stay, I need to know you're committed." Zelda lifted her chin. "I've worked hard my whole life, Mr. Ketchum. I'm not afraid of it. I can see that." He smiled slightly. "All right then. Here's what I'm proposing. You help Mrs. Brennan with the house and the cooking, and I'll pay you $20 a month plus room and board for you and your daughter. Come spring, if you want to find your own place, I'll help you with that. If you want to stay on, we can discuss a permanent arrangement." $20 a month was more than she'd hoped for, more than she could make doing laundry or mending in town. It was enough to save, enough to build a future for Clara. Zelda stuck out her hand. "You have a deal, Mr. Ketchum." His hand was warm and calloused when it closed around hers, and for a moment their eyes met and held. Something passed between them, recognition or understanding or maybe just shared relief that a problem had been solved. Then Pierce released her hand and stood up. "Call me Pierce, please. Mr. Ketchum makes me feel like my father." He walked to the door, then paused. "And Mrs. Stillwater." Welcome to the ranch. The days fell into a pattern. Zelda woke before dawn to help Mrs. Brennan prepare breakfast for the hands, worked through the morning cleaning and organizing the large house, helped prepare the midday meal, spent the afternoon on whatever tasks needed doing, and finished with supper. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done since her husband died, but it felt good to be useful, to earn her keep honestly, to fall into bed at night with muscles aching from effort rather than cold. Clara thrived in the warmth and abundance of the ranch. She helped where she could, fetching and carrying for Mrs. Brennan, and spent her free time exploring the house and watching the hands work from the windows. She didn't ask about her father anymore, but sometimes Zelda caught her watching Pierce with an expression of careful longing that broke her heart. Pierce was kind to Clara, but not overly familiar. He'd nod to her when they passed, sometimes ask her about her day, but he kept a respectful distance. With Zelda, he was unfailingly courteous but professional. They spoke mostly about household matters, about supplies needed or repairs to be done, conversations that were businesslike and brief. But Zelda found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. Watching the way he moved, economical and sure, every motion serving a purpose. Watching the way he spoke to his men, firm but fair, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Watching the way he smiled on the rare occasions when something amused him, a slow warming of his features that made her breath catch. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more. He'd saved their lives and given them a chance at a future. Of course she'd notice him. Of course she'd feel drawn to him. It didn't mean anything. Then came the night 3 weeks after they'd arrived at the ranch when Clara woke screaming from a nightmare. Zelda was at her side instantly, holding her daughter's shaking body and murmuring comfort, but Clara wouldn't be soothed. She sobbed and clung to Zelda, crying about the cold and the dark and being alone, and nothing Zelda said could calm her. She was still trying when Pierce appeared in the doorway, hastily dressed, his hair mussed from sleep. "I heard crying," he said. "Is she all right?" "Bad dream," Zelda managed, her own voice shaking. "I'm sorry we woke you." Pierce came into the room and crouched down beside the bed so he was at Clara's eye level. "Hey there, little one. Those dreams can be scary, can't they?" Clara peeked at him from where she'd buried her face against Zelda's shoulder, her eyes red and swollen. "We were in the snow again," she whispered. "Mama and me, we were so cold and nobody came." "But somebody did come," Pierce said gently. "I came, and you're here now, warm and safe, and that storm is long past." He reached out slowly, giving Clara time to pull away if she wanted, and touched her hand where it clutched Zelda's nightgown. "I promise you, as long as you're on this ranch, you'll never be that cold again. You believe me?" Clara studied his face with a child's absolute seriousness, looking for lies or false comfort. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I believe you. Good girl." Pierce stood up and his eyes met Zelda's over Clara's head. The look in them made Zelda's heart stutter in her chest. It was protective and fierce and tender all at once, and it was directed at both of them. "Try to get some sleep now, both of you." After he left, Clara settled down quickly and drifted back to sleep. But Zelda lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Pierce's words echoing in her mind. "As long as you're on this ranch, you'll never be that cold again. Not we'll keep the fires going or the house is warm. As long as you're on this ranch." Like he was including them in something, making them part of his world, his responsibility, like they belonged. The thought should have frightened her. She'd been alone for 2 years, fiercely independent, relying on no one but herself. Depending on Pierce Ketchum felt dangerous, felt like setting herself up for another loss she might not survive. But lying there in the dark, listening to Clara's peaceful breathing, she couldn't make herself pull away from the warmth of his promise. Winter deepened. The snow piled higher, and the temperatures dropped until water froze in the buckets overnight even inside the barn. The hands worked in shifts, keeping the cattle alive and the buildings intact, coming in half frozen for meals and thawing out by the fires. Zelda and Mrs. Brennan worked harder than ever, cooking massive quantities of food and keeping coffee hot around the clock. Pierce worked alongside his men, never asking them to face whether he wouldn't face himself. He came in for meals with ice in his hair and his face red from windburn, ate quickly, and went back out. Zelda found herself listening for his footsteps, counting the hours between sightings, relaxing only when she saw him safe and whole. One evening in late January, a blizzard roared in with almost no warning. The hands barely made it back to the bunkhouse, and Pierce stumbled into the kitchen half frozen, his clothes stiff with ice. Mrs. Brennan had already gone to bed, and Zelda was alone, banking the fire for the night. She took one look at Pierce and pointed to a chair by the stove. "Sit down before you fall down," she ordered, reaching for the coffee pot. "When did you last eat? Breakfast, I think." His voice was hoarse with cold and exhaustion. "Maybe yesterday's supper, I lose track." Zelda poured coffee and laced it liberally with whiskey from the bottle Mrs. Brennan kept for medicinal purposes, then set about heating leftover stew. Pierce drank the coffee in grateful gulps, and color started to return to his face. When she set the bowl of stew in front of him with bread and butter, he looked up at her with such undisguised gratitude that she had to look away. "You're going to work yourself to death," she said, more sharply than she intended. "The ranch won't run itself if you freeze in a snowbank. The cattle won't feed themselves either." But he said it without heat, already focused on the food. He ate like he did everything else, efficiently and without waste, and Zelda busied herself cleaning up, acutely aware of his presence in the quiet kitchen. When he finished, he pushed the bowl away and leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. "Thank you. That might have saved my life. Don't be dramatic." But her voice was softer now. She poured more coffee for both of them and sat down across from him, cradling her cup in both hands. "Why do you do it? Work yourself like this?" Pierce opened his eyes fully and looked at her, really looked at her, and Zelda felt heat rise in her cheeks under his regard. "This ranch is all I have. My father built it from nothing, broke his back and his health doing it, and when he died, he left it to me. I owe it to him to keep it going, to make it prosper. If that means I work myself to the bone sometimes, so be it. And if you die doing it, what happens to the ranch then?" He smiled, tired and a little sad. "I don't plan on dying anytime soon, Mrs. Stillwater." "Zelda," she said impulsively, "you call Mrs. Brennan by her name, you should call me by mine." Something shifted in his expression, some wall coming down or door opening. "Zelda," he repeated, and the way he said it in that rough, exhausted voice made her name sound like something precious. "All right then, Zelda." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the wind howl outside. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling with words. Zelda found herself studying Pierce's hands where they wrapped around his cup, noting the scars and calluses, the blunt trimmed nails and strong fingers. Working hands, hands that built and fixed and protected. "Can I ask you something?" Pierce said finally, his voice quiet. "About your husband. You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Zelda's first instinct was to change the subject, but something in his eyes stopped her. Genuine curiosity, not prurient interest. A desire to understand, not to pry. "What do you want to know? Clara never talks about him. I wondered if she remembers him at all." "She was 5 when he died. She remembers some things. His voice, mostly. He used to sing to her. Zelda paused, organizing thoughts she rarely let surface. Thomas was a good man, kind. He worked as a clerk in the general store in town. We didn't have much, but we were happy. What happened to him? Pneumonia. It came on fast, and by the time we realized how sick he was, it was too late. He was gone in 3 days. The old grief welled up, not sharp anymore, but deep and sad. The store owner gave me 2 months in our rooms above the shop. Then he needed the space for the new clerk. I took what little money Thomas had saved and rented the cabin. I thought I could make it work, picking up odd jobs in town. I didn't realize how hard winter would be. Pierce reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture so unexpected that Zelda froze. His hand was warm and solid, and after a moment she turned her hand over so their palms met. They sat like that, hands clasped across the kitchen table while the blizzard raged outside and the fire crackled in the stove. "I'm glad you came here," Pierce said finally. "I'm glad the storm brought you to us. Us. Not me. Us." Like she and Clara were already part of the ranch, part of his life. Zelda's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. "I'm glad, too," she whispered. Pierce's thumb moved slowly against her palm, a gentle back and forth that might have been unconscious. His eyes were very dark in the lamplight, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, she thought he might lean across the table and kiss her, and she realized with a shock that she wanted him to. But he didn't. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and let go, standing up and reaching for his coat. "I should check on the horses one more time before I turn in. Thank you again for the food. Be careful out there," Zelda said, and it came out more fervent than she intended. Pierce paused at the door and looked back at her, something warm and wondering in his expression. "Always am," he said, and then he was gone into the howling dark. Zelda sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, her palm still tingling where he'd touched her, and wondered what was happening to her carefully constructed walls. February came, and with it a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads impassable with mud. The hands took advantage of the warmer weather to repair everything that had broken during the worst of winter, and the ranch rang with the sounds of hammering and sawing. Clara caught a cold that kept her in bed for 3 days, and Pierce surprised Zelda by bringing her a carved wooden horse he'd made during the long evenings. "For Clara," he said, handing it to Zelda with something almost like embarrassment. "Thought she might like something to play with while she's stuck in bed." The horse was beautiful, smooth and detailed, with a flowing mane and tail. Clara's face lit up when Zelda gave it to her, and she held it like treasure, running her fingers over the polished wood. "Mr. Ketchum made this." "For me, he did." "He's nice, Mama." Clara's voice was thoughtful. "I wish he could be my papa." Zelda's breath caught. "Sweetheart, Mr. Ketchum is our employer. He's been very kind to us, but that doesn't mean—" "I know," Clara interrupted, "but I can wish, can't I?" That night, Zelda lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about wishes. Thinking about Pierce's hands carving that horse, taking time from his endless work to make something that would bring joy to a child he had no obligation to care about. Thinking about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, his eyes soft with something that might be longing. She'd told herself she wasn't looking for a new husband, that she and Clara were fine on their own. But lying there in the dark, she had to admit the truth. She was falling in love with Pierce Ketchum, had been falling since that first moment when he'd appeared out of the snow like salvation itself. And the thought of it terrified her, because loving someone meant risking loss, and she wasn't sure she could survive being broken again. The next morning at breakfast, one of the younger hands came in with news from town. "Stage came through last night. Driver says there's measles in Sacramento. They're worried it might spread this way. The table went quiet. Measles was deadly, especially to children. Pierce's face went grim and his eyes flicked to Clara, who was helping Mrs. Brennan set out plates. Anyone shows symptoms, they go straight to quarantine in the old line shack, he said firmly. And nobody goes to town unless it's absolutely necessary. We'll wait this out until it's safe. The hands nodded, and the conversation moved on, but Zelda saw the way Pierce kept looking at Clara through the rest of the meal, protective and worried. When breakfast was over and the hands had filed out, he pulled Zelda aside. "Keep a close eye on her," he said quietly. "Any sign of fever or rash, you tell me immediately. I'll ride to town for the doctor myself if I have to. She's not your responsibility, Pierce." But Zelda's voice was gentle, not accusatory. "Yes, she is." He said it simply, as if it were an obvious fact. "You both are." He walked away before Zelda could respond, leaving her standing in the hallway with her heart pounding and her mind racing. You both are. Not as employees, not as charity cases. As people he cared about, people he felt responsible for protecting. As family. The measles outbreak never reached Jamestown, but the scare changed something in the household. Pierce stopped maintaining his careful distance from Clara. He'd lift her onto his shoulders to see the new foals in the barn, let her follow him around asking endless questions about ranch work, bring her sweets from town when he had to go for supplies. And Clara blossomed under his attention, her smiles coming easier, her laughter ringing through the house. Watching them together made Zelda's chest ache with complicated emotion. Joy, because Clara deserved to have a good man in her life, someone steady and kind who wouldn't leave. Fear, because what would happen if they had to leave the ranch, if Clara got attached and then lost Pierce too? And underneath it all, a growing certainty that her own feelings for Pierce had moved far beyond gratitude or simple attraction into something deeper and more dangerous. March brought the first real signs of spring. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. The days grew longer, and the cattle began dropping calves that needed watching and protecting from predators. The work shifted from survival to growth, and the mood on the ranch lightened. Pierce started taking his meals with Zelda and Mrs. Brennan in the kitchen rather than with the hands in the dining room, and the evening meals became something Zelda looked forward to all day. They'd talk about anything and everything, their conversation ranging from books they'd read to memories of childhood to debates about politics and religion. Pierce was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions he'd clearly reasoned out for himself, and he listened to Zelda's views with genuine interest, never dismissing her thoughts just because she was a woman. One evening after Clara had gone to bed and Mrs. Brennan had retired to her room, Zelda and Pierce sat alone at the kitchen table, lingering over coffee. The lamp burned low between them, casting soft shadows, and through the open window came the sound of night birds and the distant lowing of cattle. "Can I ask you something personal?" Zelda said, emboldened by the intimacy of the moment. "You can ask. I might not answer." But Pierce was smiling, relaxed in a way he rarely was during the day. "Why haven't you married? A man like you, with a successful ranch and a good character, there must be women in town who'd be interested." Pierce's smile faded and he looked down at his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands. "There were women interested, yes, but they wanted the ranch, not me. They saw opportunity, not partnership. I watched my mother and father build this place together, working side by side, equal partners in everything. That's what I want. Someone who sees me, not what I can provide. Someone who'd choose me even if I had nothing." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Zelda's heart beat faster as she realized what he wasn't saying, what he might be hoping for. She chose her next words carefully. That person exists. Someone who sees your kindness and your strength and your dedication. Someone who admires the man you are, not what you own. Pierce's eyes came up to meet hers, and the look in them was raw and vulnerable. "Is that what you see, Zelda?" She could deflect, could pretend she was speaking theoretically. But sitting there in the quiet kitchen with this good, honest man looking at her with hope and fear mixing in his eyes, she couldn't lie. "Yes, that's what I see." Pierce stood up so fast his chair nearly fell over. For a moment he just stared at her, breathing hard, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he was moving around the table, pulling her to her feet, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said roughly. "Tell me you feel it too, this thing between us." "I feel it," Zelda whispered. "I've been feeling it for weeks. I tried not to, I tried to keep my distance, but I can't anymore." Pierce's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, tracing the curve of her face like he was memorizing it by touch. "I've been half in love with you since the day I found you in the snow. Watching you fight so hard to take care of your daughter, seeing your strength and your pride even when you were freezing to death. And every day since, falling a little more. The way you smile at Clara, the way you work, the way you think. Everything about you." Zelda's hands came up to cover his where they cradled her face. "I didn't want to love again. I didn't think I could survive losing someone else. But you made me hope, Pierce. You made me believe in second chances." "I would never leave you," Pierce said fiercely. "Not by choice, not ever. Whatever happens, we face it together. You and me and Clara. A family." The word broke something open in Zelda's chest, some last defense crumbling. "A family," she repeated, and then she was rising on her toes and Pierce was bending down and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. He kissed her softly at first, questioning, giving her room to pull away. But Zelda pressed closer, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, and the kiss deepened. Pierce's arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. They kissed until Zelda was breathless and dizzy, until the world narrowed to just the two of them and the beating of their hearts in sync. When they finally broke apart, Pierce rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast, I know we should probably wait, but I don't want to. I want you as my wife, I want Clara as my daughter, I want us to be a real family. Say yes, Zelda, please say yes." Zelda laughed, the sound watery with unshed tears. "Yes, yes, of course yes." Pierce kissed her again, hard and triumphant, then swept her up in his arms and spun her around the kitchen. Zelda clutched his shoulders and laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years, feeling like maybe happy endings were real after all. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Jamestown, with Mrs. Brennan and the ranch hands as witnesses. Clara stood beside Zelda in a new dress Pierce had bought for her, beaming so hard her face might split. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Pierce kissed Zelda in front of God and everyone, Clara cheered and threw the wildflowers she'd picked that morning into the air like confetti. The reception was held at the ranch, with food and music and dancing that lasted until the stars came out. But the moment Zelda remembered most vividly came earlier in the day, just after the ceremony. Clara had been standing a little apart from the celebrating adults, holding the wooden horse Pierce had carved for her and looking uncertain. Pierce had seen her and walked over, going down on one knee in the dust of the churchyard so they were eye to eye. "Clara, I want to ask you something important," he'd said, his voice serious. "I married your mama today, which makes me your stepfather. But if you're willing, I'd like to adopt you properly. Make you my daughter in the eyes of the law. Would that be all right with you?" Clara had stared at him, her eyes going wide and shiny with tears. "You want to be my real papa, more than anything." Clara threw herself into his arms so hard she nearly knocked him over, sobbing into his shoulder. Pierce held her close, one hand cupping the back of her head, his own eyes suspiciously bright. And Zelda, watching them, had felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst with love. "I'll take that as a yes," Pierce said, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled back just enough to look at Clara's tear-stained face. "You have a papa now, Clara. You have one now, and you'll have one for the rest of your life. I promise you that." Life settled into a new pattern after the wedding. Zelda moved her and Clara's belongings into Pierce's room, the master bedroom with its wide bed and windows that looked out over the ranch. The first night she spent there as Pierce's wife, she lay awake for a long time, listening to his steady breathing beside her and marveling at how safe she felt, how cherished. Pierce was a considerate husband, patient and gentle with her as they learned each other's bodies and rhythms. He made love to her like she was something rare and beautiful, taking his time, making sure she found pleasure before he sought his own. And afterward he'd hold her close, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her skin, and they'd talk in whispers about their hopes and dreams for the future. Clara adjusted to having a father with an ease that sometimes startled Zelda. Within a month, she was calling Pierce Papa without hesitation, following him around the ranch and chattering about everything she saw and thought. Pierce listened with apparent fascination to her observations about the chickens or the clouds or the way the barn cats played, and answered her endless questions with patience Zelda found remarkable. "How do you do it?" Zelda asked him one night after Clara had finally exhausted herself and gone to bed. "Stay so patient with all those questions. She must drive you mad sometimes." Pierce looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would she drive me mad? She's curious, she wants to understand the world." "That's how children learn. And besides," he pulled Zelda close, kissing her temple, "I love hearing what she thinks about. She sees things I'd never notice on my own, makes me look at the ranch differently." It was such a Pierce response, thoughtful and sincere, that Zelda could only smile and kiss him. Spring turned to summer and the ranch exploded with life and activity. The cattle were driven to higher pastures, the horses were trained, the gardens planted and tended. Zelda worked alongside Mrs. Brennan, but now as the lady of the house rather than hired help. She found she liked the responsibility, liked making decisions about the household and implementing improvements. One afternoon in late June, Pierce came to find her in the kitchen where she was making preserves from the first strawberries of the season. He looked excited in a way she rarely saw, his eyes bright and his mouth curved in a smile. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. "I want to show you something." He led her out to the barn and to a stall where a beautiful paint mare stood with a newborn foal on spindly legs. The foal was still wet, all big eyes and uncertain steps, staying close to its mother. "She was born about an hour ago," Pierce said. "Perfect timing too, nice easy birth. I thought Clara might like to name her. What do you think?" Zelda looked at the foal, then at Pierce, then burst out laughing. "You're spoiling her terribly, you know that. I'm her father, that's my job." But Pierce was grinning, unrepentant. "Go get her, would you? I want to see her face." Clara's reaction was everything Pierce had hoped for and more. She stood at the stall gate with her mouth open, staring at the foal like it was the most magical thing she'd ever seen. When Pierce lifted her up so she could pet the baby horse's soft nose, she looked at him with such adoration that Zelda had to blink back tears. "She's really mine," Clara breathed. "Really yours. But you have to take care of her properly, which means learning to feed and groom her and eventually ride her. Think you can handle that?" "I can handle it." Clara said it with absolute conviction. I'm going to name her Snowdrop because she's white like snow but pretty like a flower." Pierce set Clara down and she immediately started talking to the foal in a soft voice, telling Snowdrop all about the ranch and how they were going to be best friends. Pierce moved to stand beside Zelda, sliding his arm around her waist. "That was a good thing you did," Zelda said quietly. "She deserves good things. You both do. All the good things I can give you." Pierce turned to look at her, his expression suddenly serious. "I never knew I could be this happy, Zelda. Every morning I wake up and you're beside me and Clara's down the hall and it feels like I'm living in a dream." "Me too." Zelda leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I think about that day in the snow, how close we came to dying, and I can't believe we ended up here, with you. It feels like fate." "Maybe it was." Pierce kissed the top of her head. "Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every single day." August brought scorching heat and long days of work. The hands grumbled about the temperature but kept at their tasks, and Pierce was everywhere at once, supervising and helping and making sure nothing fell through the cracks. Zelda worried about him working too hard, but Pierce seemed energized rather than exhausted, thriving on the challenges the ranch presented. One evening after supper, Pierce asked Zelda to take a walk with him. They strolled away from the house, toward the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the ranch. The sun was setting in shades of gold and pink, and the air was finally cooling after the heat of the day. "I've been thinking," Pierce said as they walked hand in hand, "about the future. About expanding the ranch." "Expanding how?" Zelda asked. "There's a property adjacent to ours, about 1,000 acres, that might come up for sale. If we could buy it, we could increase our herd significantly, maybe even start breeding horses seriously instead of just as a sideline." He paused, looking uncertain in a way that was rare for him. "It would mean taking on debt, working even harder for a few years to make it pay. I wanted to know what you thought before I pursued it." Zelda stopped walking and turned to face him. "You're asking my opinion about a business decision." "Of course I am. We're partners, aren't we? This ranch belongs to both of us now. I'm not making major decisions without your input." The casual way he said it, like it was obvious that her thoughts mattered, made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. "I think if you believe we can make it work, we should try. You've never steered us wrong yet." Pierce pulled her close and kissed her, slow and deep, there beside the creek with the sunset painting the sky. "Have I told you today that I love you?" he murmured against her lips. "Not since this morning." "Well then, I love you, Zelda Ketchum, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I love you too." Zelda kissed him again, then pulled back with a smile. "And I have something to tell you. I've been waiting for the right moment." Pierce's eyes searched her face. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant. About 3 months along, I think. The baby should come in January." For a moment Pierce just stared at her, his expression blank with shock. Then joy broke across his face like sunrise, brilliant and transformative. He let out a whoop and picked Zelda up, spinning her around before carefully setting her back on her feet, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby. Zelda, I don't have words. I'm so happy I could burst." "Me too." Zelda covered his hands with hers, holding them to her belly. "Clara's excited too. I told her this morning and she's already planning how to be the best big sister in the world." Pierce laughed and pulled Zelda close, wrapping her in his arms and holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They stood there together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared, talking quietly about names and nurseries and the future they were building together. The months that followed were busy and full. Pierce bought the adjacent property and threw himself into making it productive, and Zelda oversaw improvements to the house. including converting a room next to the master bedroom into a nursery. Clara helped with the painting, getting more on herself than the walls, and proudly showed everyone the rocking chair Pierce had built for when the baby came. Zelda's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the last months were uncomfortable in ways she remembered from carrying Clara. Pierce fussed over her constantly, trying to make her rest, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard. It drove Zelda slightly crazy, but she loved him for caring enough to worry. December came, and with it the first heavy snows. Zelda grew large and ungainly, waddling more than walking, feeling the baby move constantly inside her. The doctor from town came out to the ranch to check on her and pronounced everything normal and healthy, predicting the baby would come right on schedule in mid-January. But babies have their own timing. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, Zelda woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the first pains of labor. She lay still for a moment, breathing through the contraction, then reached over to shake Pierce's shoulder. "It's time," she said quietly. Pierce was awake and alert instantly, his cowboy instincts kicking in. "I'll get Mrs. Brennan and send someone for the doctor. There's no rush yet. It'll be hours." But Pierce was already pulling on clothes, moving with controlled urgency. "I'm getting the doctor anyway. I'm not taking chances with you or the baby." Zelda smiled despite the discomfort. "All right, but come back as soon as you can. I want you here." Pierce stopped long enough to kiss her thoroughly. "Nothing could keep me away. You hold on, you hear me? Wait for me to get back." He was gone before Zelda could point out that the baby would come when it was ready regardless of what anyone wanted. Mrs. Brennan appeared shortly after, calm and competent, and helped Zelda into a clean nightgown and settled her in bed. Clara peeked in, worried, and Zelda reassured her that everything was fine, that this was normal, that she'd have a baby brother or sister before the day was out. The labor was long and hard, but no worse than when she'd had Clara. The pains came and went in waves, building slowly, and Zelda breathed through them while Mrs. Brennan brought cool cloths and words of encouragement. Pierce returned with the doctor just after noon, and relief washed over Zelda at the sight of his face. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. "Right here beside you, all the way through." And he was. He stayed through the long afternoon as the contractions intensified and grew closer together. He let Zelda squeeze his hand until his fingers went white, wiped the sweat from her face, murmured encouragement when she was certain she couldn't do this anymore. The doctor checked her progress periodically and pronounced everything normal, and Mrs. Brennan kept bringing fresh water and clean linens. As the sun was setting, painting the snow outside the window pink and gold, the urge to push became overwhelming. The doctor positioned himself at the foot of the bed and gave instructions, and Zelda bore down with all her strength, Pierce's hand tight in hers, his voice in her ear telling her she was doing beautifully. She was so strong, just a little more. The baby came in a rush just as the last light left the sky, a lusty cry filling the room. The doctor caught the infant and laughed. "It's a boy, a healthy baby boy." Pierce let out a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and Zelda felt tears streaming down her face. A boy. They had a son. The doctor cleaned the baby quickly and laid him on Zelda's chest, and she looked down at the tiny red face, the dark hair plastered to his scalp, the perfect miniature fingers flexing against her skin. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Pierce touched the baby's head with one finger, his hand shaking. "He's perfect. Zelda, he's absolutely perfect." Clara was allowed in shortly after, her eyes huge as she looked at her new brother. "He's so small," she breathed. "Can I hold him?" Pierce helped her sit in the rocking chair and carefully placed the baby in her arms. showing her how to support his head. Clara looked down at the infant with an expression of wonder and fierce protectiveness that reminded Zelda so much of Pierce. It made her heart ache. "Hello, baby brother," Clara said softly. "I'm your big sister, and I'm going to take care of you and teach you everything I know. You're going to love it here. We have the best papa in the world." Pierce's eyes met Zelda's over Clara's head, both of them blinking back tears. In that moment, with their children and each other, the ranch quiet around them and snow falling softly outside, Zelda felt a completeness she'd never known was possible. They named the baby Thomas Pierce Ketchum, after Zelda's late husband and his new father. Pierce held his son and looked at Zelda with questions in his eyes, and she nodded. "Thomas was a good man, and he gave me Clara. I want to honor that. And I want our son to carry your name too, to know who his father is." Pierce's voice was rough when he answered. "I'll make sure he knows. I'll make sure both our children always know they're loved and wanted and protected. I swear it." The winter of 1880 was bitterly cold, but inside the ranch house, life was warm and full. Zelda recovered from the birth quickly, and Thomas proved to be an easy baby, feeding well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. Clara took her role as big sister seriously, always wanting to help with the baby, singing to him and showing him her treasures. Pierce was a devoted father, getting up in the night when Thomas cried so Zelda could rest, walking the floor with the baby against his shoulder, talking to his son about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they'd do together when Thomas was older. Watching him with the baby, Zelda marveled again at how lucky she was, how far they'd come from that desperate morning when she'd nearly frozen to death trying to reach help. Spring came early that year, the snow melting by mid-March and the first green shoots appearing in the fields. Pierce hired 2 more hands to help with the expanded ranch, and the work of calving and planting began in earnest. Thomas grew fat and happy, his dark eyes starting to focus and track movement, his toothless smiles lighting up his whole face. One afternoon in early April, Zelda was sitting on the porch with Thomas in her arms, watching Clara and Pierce in the corral with Snowdrop. Clara was learning to ride, and Pierce walked beside the little mare, one hand on the lead rope, talking Clara through the basics of posture and rein handling. Clara's face was scrunched in concentration, but she was clearly loving every minute. Mrs. Brennan came out to join Zelda, sitting down in the other rocking chair with a sigh. "Those 2 are thick as thieves," she said, nodding toward Pierce and Clara. "You'd never know she wasn't his from birth." "I know." Zelda watched Pierce laugh at something Clara said, his whole face lighting up with affection. "Sometimes I have to remind myself that they haven't always been together. It feels like they have. That's because Pierce has the gift of loving completely. When he commits to someone, he's all in, no holding back." Mrs. Brennan glanced at Zelda. "You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to him, you know. Before you came, he was just going through the motions, working himself to death for a ranch that was just walls and fence posts. Now it's a home, a family. You gave him that. He gave us everything," Zelda said quietly. "A home, security, love. I don't know where we'd be if he hadn't found us that day." "You'd have found a way to survive. You're a strong woman, Zelda, but I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone." Mrs. Brennan stood up, patting Zelda's shoulder. "I'll start supper. You sit here and enjoy the sunshine." After Mrs. Brennan went inside, Zelda sat rocking gently, holding Thomas and watching her husband teach her daughter to ride. The sun was warm on her face, and the breeze smelled of new grass and possibilities. A year and a half ago, she'd been struggling to survive, terrified for her daughter's future, seeing no way forward. Now she had a husband she loved deeply, 2 beautiful children, a home that was solid and prosperous, and a future that looked bright. Pierce caught her eye across the corral and smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip. Zelda smiled back, feeling love wash over her like sunshine, warm and golden and infinite. Summer passed in a blur of work and family time. Clara turned 9 and Pierce threw her a party with cake and presents, inviting several families from town. Thomas learned to roll over and then to sit up, babbling constantly and laughing at everything. The ranch prospered, the new land producing well, the cattle multiplying, the horse breeding program starting to gain attention. In August, Pierce came home from town with news. The railroad's coming through next year. They're planning a stop in Jamestown, which means we'll be able to ship cattle and horses much more easily. Could double our profits within 2 years if we play it right. They talked long into the night about expansion plans and possibilities, Zelda's mind spinning with ideas. She loved this, loved being Pierce's partner in truth, making decisions together, building something that would last. We should think about schooling for Clara soon, Zelda said. She's bright, and I've been teaching her what I can, but she needs more than I can give her. Pierce nodded thoughtfully. There's talk of building a proper school in town now that more families are settling. I could contribute to the building fund, make sure it happens sooner. And when Thomas is older, he'll need education too. Look at us, planning for the future like we have all the time in the world, Zelda said with a smile. Pierce pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. We do have all the time in the world. We have our whole lives ahead of us, building this ranch, raising our children, growing old together. And I intend to enjoy every single day of it. The years flowed by, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Clara grew into a confident young girl, skilled with horses and knowledgeable about ranch work. She was clever with her studies too, excelling at the new school that opened in town when she was 10. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to little boy, following his father around like a shadow, learning ranch work almost before he could walk properly. In the spring of 1883, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. The baby came in November, a girl they named Sarah after Pierce's mother. She had Pierce's dark hair and Zelda's blue eyes, and from the moment she entered the world, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Clara, now 12, was an excellent help with the baby. Thomas, at 3.5, was less helpful but very interested, constantly wanting to know what the baby was doing and why. Pierce watched his growing family with an expression of contentment that never seemed to fade, and Zelda thanked God every day for the life they'd built. The ranch continued to prosper. With the railroad connection, they were able to ship cattle to markets as far as San Francisco, and Pierce's horse breeding program gained a reputation for quality. They hired more hands, built a second barn, expanded the house to give the children proper bedrooms as they grew through it all. The love between Pierce and Zelda only deepened. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when they could, talking long into the night after the children were asleep. Pierce never stopped looking at Zelda like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and she never stopped marveling at the steady strength and kindness of the man she'd married. One winter evening in 1885, with snow falling softly outside and the children finally in bed, Zelda and Pierce sat together in front of the fire in their bedroom. Zelda was mending one of Thomas's shirts, and Pierce was reviewing account books, both of them comfortable in the quiet companionship of a long marriage. "You remember the day we met?" Zelda asked suddenly. Pierce looked up from his books and smiled. "Every detail. You and Clara stumbling through the snow, half frozen, you so fierce and determined to take care of your daughter even when you could barely stand. I knew right then you were someone special. I was terrified, Zelda admitted. Of the cold, of not being able to provide for Clara, of what would happen to us. And then you appeared like something out of a dream and everything changed. Pierce set aside his books and moved to sit beside Zelda on the settee, taking the mending from her hands and setting it aside so he could hold her properly. Best day of my life, that storm. Brought me everything I'd been missing without knowing it. A wife, a family, a reason to build something that matters. We've come a long way, Zelda said, leaning into his warmth. We have. And we're going to keep going, keep building, keep loving each other through whatever comes. Pierce kissed her temple. I meant what I said that night when I proposed. Whatever happens, we face it together. That hasn't changed and it never will. Zelda turned in his arms and kissed him properly, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they broke apart, Pierce's eyes were soft and warm in the firelight. I love you, Zelda whispered. So much it scares me sometimes. I love you too. Always have, always will. Pierce stood and pulled her to her feet, leading her toward their bed. Now come here and let me show you how much. The children grew and the ranch grew, and the years passed in a blur of joy and hard work and love. Clara blossomed into a beautiful young woman, smart and capable, eventually marrying the son of a neighboring rancher and settling close enough to visit regularly. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, taking on more responsibility at the ranch and showing an aptitude for horse training that made Pierce burst with pride. Sarah proved to be clever and stubborn, keeping her parents on their toes and charming everyone she met. In 1890, Zelda and Pierce celebrated their 10th anniversary with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the county. Standing in the barn that had been cleared and decorated for dancing, watching Pierce waltz Clara across the floor with Thomas and Sarah laughing at something nearby, Zelda felt a bone-deep satisfaction with the life they'd created. Mrs. Brennan appeared at her elbow, older now but still sharp-eyed and competent. Happy anniversary, dear. You and Pierce have built something wonderful here. We have, haven't we? Zelda watched Pierce laugh at something Clara said, his face creased with smile lines that hadn't been there a decade ago. Sometimes I still can't quite believe it's real. It's real, Mrs. Brennan assured her. As real as love and hard work can make anything. You two have earned every bit of happiness you've found. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the children were in bed, Pierce and Zelda walked out to look at the ranch in the moonlight. The house glowed with lamplight behind them, solid and welcoming. The barn stood dark against the starry sky, full of horses and cattle that represented years of work and planning. The land stretched out in all directions, familiar and beloved. "What are you thinking?" Pierce asked, his arm around Zelda's waist. "That I'm grateful. For all of this, for you, for our family, for the storm that brought us together." Zelda leaned into him, breathing in the scent of him, horse and leather and home. "For every single day we've had together." Pierce turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face in the gesture that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "I was thinking the same thing. You and Clara showing up in that blizzard was the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me purpose, gave me love, gave me a family, made all of this," he gestured at the ranch around them, "mean something." "We made it together," Zelda corrected softly. "Together," Pierce agreed. He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, there under the stars with the snow crunching under their feet and their whole lives ahead of them. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges that Pierce and Zelda met together. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease and horses injured in accidents. There were market fluctuations that tested their finances and disputes with neighbors over water rights. But through all of it, they stood together, partners in every sense of the word, drawing strength from each other and from the family they'd built. Clara gave them grandchildren, 3 lively boys who loved visiting the ranch and learning from their grandfather. Thomas eventually married as well, bringing home a sensible young woman from Sacramento who took to ranch life with enthusiasm. Sarah, always the most independent of the 3 children, announced her intention to become a teacher and went to San Francisco for training, returning to teach at the school in Jamestown. In the summer of 1895, Zelda and Pierce celebrated their 5th